Hello, and welcome to World of Warbirds. I'm Brian Pierce. Hello, Warbirders. So if I say World War II naval aviation to you, what comes to mind? I'm pretty sure what you saw in your mind's eye was flat-top aircraft carriers launching and recovering aircraft. Depending on what turns you crank, you're either seeing Hellcats, Avengers, Corsairs, Seafires, Sea Furies, or even Vals, Kates, and Zeros. But there was a whole other type of naval aviation that doesn't need an actual aircraft carrier. And that is the catapult-launched seaplane. And an example of one of the most successful types of those is the subject of today's episode, the Vought OS2U Kingfisher. Since the earliest days of naval warfare, seeing the other guy first is always best. And as soon as someone figured out how to lower, launch, and retrieve a seaplane, navies were very interested. Add in radios, and these type of aircraft were found to be very useful in finding targets. After the battle was joined, they would observe where the shots from the big guns were falling for corrections and could accurately assess the damage done to enemy ships. As time went on, more uses were found for these aircraft, including directing submarines to targets for torpedo attack, search and rescue missions, and air cover for infantry amphibious operations. Catapult-launched and crane-recovered aircraft became a must-have for capital ships. And it was into this environment that our Vought OS2U Kingfisher was born. Design and development. In the mid-1930s, the U.S. Navy was using a single-engine biplane, the Curtiss Seagull, as their catapult-launched seaplane. However, it was underpowered, and the Navy almost immediately began looking for a replacement. The Vought company had a very long history with the U.S. Navy. In 1922, it was a Vought VE-7 trainer that made the first takeoff from the deck of the USS Langley, which was the first American aircraft carrier. In the late 1930s, realizing that the Navy was seeking something to replace the Seagull, Vought asked engineer Rex P. Basil to work on the project. We'll hear about him later in another episode when we talk about the super famous Corsair. Basil and his Vought team planned for a long-range, rugged aircraft that would be very versatile for multi-role functionality, not just observing and spotting. Basil designed the aircraft around the Pratt & Whitney R985 Wasp Jr., which, as the name implies, was a smaller version of the Wasp engine for use in medium-sized aircraft. It was an air-cooled, 9-cylinder radial with a gear-driven single-speed centrifugal-type supercharger. Wasp Juniors have powered such other famous and extremely successful water-based aircraft, such as the de Havilland Canada DHC-2 Beaver and Grumman G-21 Goose. Although a great engine, it was on the small size for an aircraft such as the Kingfisher, and these aircraft would never be breaking any speed records. But there was thinking behind this choice of engine. It was lighter and had less fuel consumption than its bigger brother, which was good. Attached to this engine was a low-wing cantilever monoplane fuselage with a big cockpit and a huge canopy with excellent visibility for the pilot, who was seated in front of the wing, and the rearward-facing crewman in the back, who would be busy acting as an observer or radio operator or gunner, depending on the need. There was a third seat in between the two in order to carry a passenger if need be. In order to get all they could out of the aircraft with the modest engine power of the Wasp Jr., Basil designed high-lift devices into the wing, including massive deflector plate flaps and ailerons that drooped, basically making the entire trailing edge of the wing a massive flap to increase the camber of the wing and thus create additional lift. Spoilers were mounted on the upper wing surfaces to provide roll control. This fuselage was mounted on top of a single large float under the fuselage and smaller stabilizing floats mounted outboard on each wing. For fighting, the pilot had a .30 caliber Browning M1919 machine gun mounted low in the right front cockpit and firing between the engine cylinder heads. The radio operator gunner had one or two .30 cals on a flexible ring mount. The aircraft would be able to carry two 100-pound bombs or two 325-pound depth charges. Prototypes. The first prototype flew in 1938 under the Navy designation OS2U-1, and unlike some aircraft which have long periods of teething pains and trouble working out kinks and bugs, this aircraft was basically good and ready to go from the start. The U.S. Navy ordered a first batch of 54 right away. Vought decided to name the aircraft after the Kingfisher, a pretty bird with orange and blue colorings that, as the name implies, does live near rivers and eat fish. Production. Almost all the Kingfishers were built by Vought in 3 variants, although there wasn't much difference between them. The main variant was the OS2U-3, which had self-sealing fuel tanks and additional armor protection installed for the crew. In 1939, the Navy ordered 158 more aircraft, including more than 100 that would be delivered as land planes for shore-based anti-submarine work, although these aircraft came with float kits to switch them back to seaplanes if needed. In 1940, the Navy asked for 1,006 more. The Kingfisher was becoming the workhorse of the fleet. Eventually, all U.S. battleships and cruisers would be carrying them, and some were transferred to other nations as part of Lend-Lease. The U.S. Navy was worried that Vought would not be able to build enough Kingfishers without impacting the production of their other important naval aircraft, the Corsair, so the Navy built 300 itself at its own naval aircraft factory in 1942. Operational history. There were Kingfishers sitting on battleship row catapults on December 7, 1941, during the Japanese attack, and they went along wherever the fleet went when the U.S. Navy went on the offensive. This was even as their designed role as a naval gunnery spotter declined. Naval guns were soon being aimed by better and better radar equipment, and most World War II battles at sea were being fought by carrier-based aircraft. The slow Kingfisher would be a sitting duck in the middle of that kind of aerial combat, but the aircraft was versatile enough to play an important role right up until the end of the war. Inshore patrol squadron Kingfishers flew hundreds and hundreds of unglamorous but vital anti-submarine patrols off the coasts of America. With full fuel and carrying 1 depth charge, they could typically cover a patrol radius of about 350 miles. Although at shorter ranges, they could carry 2 depth charges. On the afternoon of 15th July 1942, the USS Unicoi was escorting a convoy off Cape Lookout, North Carolina, when the German submarine U-576 attacked and torpedoed 3 merchant ships. When the submarine surfaced only 350 yards from the Unicoi, the ship fired a shell and scored a hit. Right after, 2 Kingfishers who were on the convoy's air cover swooped in on the submarine and dropped their depth charges. One of them actually hit the submarine and slid off before blowing up along the sub's side. 4 depth charges were dropped and the U-boat went down, leaving behind an oil slick and debris field. In the Western Aleutians, Kingfishers attacked and bombed Japanese-occupied shore installations. In a true rarity for this aircraft that was not designed for dogfighting, a Kingfisher shot down a Mitsubishi A6M50 near Iwo Jima in February 1945. For an airplane whose main role had evaporated, the Kingfisher seemed to fit for many roles for which it hadn't really been designed. Because of a severe shortage of training aircraft, some Kingfishers went to NAS Pensacola and NAS Jacksonville to serve as trainers for transitions from primary to intermediate flight training. It just proves how stable and forgiving the aircraft was, because none of them were fitted with dual controls. Even though Kingfishers were no longer being used for spotting for ship versus ship gunfighting, they were later called up to direct the big battleship shore bombardments that preceded the amphibious assaults of the Pacific island-hopping campaign. Also, more and more the Kingfishers would be serving as search and rescue aircraft and would forever be fondly remembered by downed airmen as the sweet sound of salvation coming from the sky to save them. Kingfishers didn't just serve with the U.S. Navy. 52 went to the Royal Navy, where they were known as Kingfisher 1. They served as scouts and flew from catapult-equipped merchant and light cruisers. 18 went to the Royal Australian Air Force, where they did offshore patrol duties. A handful also ended up flying for Chile, Mexico, Uruguay, and the Dominican Republic. Flight operations. So, how did the launch and recovery of these aircraft happen? While embarked, They were usually stored and serviced while still on their launch catapults. When it was time for a mission, the crew would climb aboard and start the engine and do their pre-flight checks and run-up. Once the engine was properly warmed up and they were ready to go, the catapult was swung out and the ship turned so the catapult was pointing towards the relative wind, which helped provide additional lift. The aircraft were launched with an 8-inch black powder charge, basically an artillery shell blank, which gave the Kingfisher a velocity of 60 knots at the end of the catapult run, which was enough for level flight. It must have been a real kick in the pants. It could also be launched by simply hoisting it from a crane down onto the water, where it would take off itself. After the mission, the ship would make a sweeping turn in order to create a smooth patch of water in its lee, and it was there that the Kingfisher would set down. Then the plane would water taxi alongside the ship. Sometimes the ship would be towing a sled in the water that the aircraft would taxi up to and lock on before being hooked onto the top of the fuselage and then winched aboard. There were also instances where there was no sled, but the observer climbed out on the roof of the aircraft to snag and snap on the line to the roof before the engine is shut down and they are pulled on board. Pilots. In 1942, Henry Stimson, the U.S. Secretary of War, gave Eddie Rickenbacher a sweeping letter of authorization, which basically allowed him to go anywhere and do just about anything for the war effort. So who was Eddie Rickenbacher? Eddie Rickenbacher was a pilot, but as far as I know, he never flew the Kingfisher. So why are we talking about him? If you haven't heard of him, it's understandable. He has faded somewhat into history, but he really shouldn't have. He's one of those guys where you wonder just how one single person could have done so much in one lifetime. He did stuff before World War I, but I'm not even going to get into all that. During the First World War, he trained as a fighter pilot and earned 26 kills in combat, which was the American record until it was surpassed by Richard Bong's 40 kills earned in a P-38 Lightning in World War II. Eddie earned 8 Distinguished Service Crosses, one of which was converted into the Medal of Honor in 1930. You'd think all that would be enough for one person's lifetime, but between the wars he designed cars, bought and ran the Indianapolis Motor Speedway for 10 years, met and married an heiress, bought and sold the Allison Engine Company, was VP for GM, and then he formed and ran Eastern Airlines. Between the wars, Eddie was an America Firster and isolationist and had clashed very publicly with President Roosevelt over many policies, including the New Deal. However, when the war in Europe broke out, Eddie renounced his isolationist stance and started working to support Britain's war effort, including using Eastern Airlines to transport munitions and supplies. It was during this time that Eddie was tasked by Stimson to hand-deliver a letter from President Roosevelt to General Douglas MacArthur in the Pacific. Although the contents of the letter have never been made public, it is suspected that the letter was to tell the outspoken general to knock it off with his public criticisms of the president, his administration, and General Marshall. I guess Stimson thought Eddie, who had also had his differences with the president, was the right guy to deliver the message and convince MacArthur to be a team player. Are you beginning to wonder when the Kingfisher is going to come into the story? Please just hold on a little longer. Eddie was provided with a B-17 Flying Fortress as transport, and he was on board this aircraft when a defect in a navigation instrument put them hundreds of miles off course in enemy-controlled waters and out of touch with anyone else. They disappeared. For days and days, the US AAF and the US Navy searched for Eddie and his crew, and after 2 weeks, the search was called off. Newspapers and radio broadcasts reported that the national icon, Eddie Rickenbacher, was dead. However, his wife played the VIP card and made a public appeal to continue the search, and it was extended by a week. On November 13th, Eddie and 3 other crew members were floating at sea in a tiny raft. They were sunburned, starving, and almost mad with thirst. Sometime during the day, they heard something. They must have wondered at their own senses by that time. But at some point the sound must have become more defined and recognizable to the airmen, including the consummate mechanic and pilot Eddie. It was the sound of a radial engine. It was the sound of a Pratt & Whitney Wasp Jr. engine that was powering Lieutenant William F. Ade's OS2U 3 Kingfisher. He spotted and rescued the castaways and was awarded the Navy's Air Medal for his efforts. Rickenbacher recovered, completed his trip, and delivered his message to General MacArthur. After the war, he continued to run Eastern Airlines, and he died in 1973. His eulogy was given by none other than Lieutenant General Jimmy Doolittle. Sadly, Lieutenant Ady, the pilot of the rescuing Kingfisher, would be lost at sea himself when he and his Kingfisher never returned from a patrol, and he was never found. The last pilot I'm going to tell you about is Lieutenant Junior Grade John Burns. In April 1944, U.S. carrier-based aircraft were attacking the Japanese-held Pacific island of Truk. The Japanese were tenaciously holding on to their island and had shot up multiple U.S. aircraft, including an Avenger and F-6F Hellcat, that had nonetheless managed to limp away smoking and full of holes from the battle to set down in the ocean. The crews climbed into rafts and tried to stay away from the island and capture by the Japanese. Lieutenant Burns was flying for Observation Squadron 6 on board the battleship North Carolina. On the day in question, Burns and his buddy, Lieutenant John J. Dowdle Jr., had both been launched off the battleship in their Kingfishers to look for downed airmen. They soon spotted a downed Hellcat pilot in the water. The decision was made for Dowdle's Kingfisher to land to pick up the fighter pilot, which he did. While maneuvering on the rough seas, Dowdle's Kingfisher was hit by a severe gust of wind which flipped over his aircraft. Now Dowdle and his radio man were in the water too, clinging to the wreck of their Kingfisher along with the Hellcat pilot. Seeing his buddy already being flipped over and pondering the 5-foot seas below, Burns must have been uncertain about his own chances, but he decided to give it a shot in putting their own Kingfisher down on the water. But they did, and they successfully picked up the 3 wet airmen, and luckily enough, a U.S. submarine, the USS Tang, had surfaced nearby, and so Burns water-taxied his Kingfisher over to the sub and offloaded the 3 rescued airmen. He then took off to look for more. It didn't take long when Burns saw 3 more rafts and gave their position by radio to the Tang, and then set up to circle the survivors until the sub arrived. However, the sub wasn't showing up. The Tang had headed off in another direction to rescue other downed airmen. After a while of circling, Burns was worried that the Tang might not come in time, so he made the gutsy decision again to land and pick up the men in the rafts. Even while he was doing that, another Avenger ditched nearby and jumped into their life rafts. Burns taxied over to their positions, threw them a line, and tried to tow them, but this threatened to swamp the rafts, so the crewmen climbed onto Burns' Kingfisher, hanging onto the wings and fuselage wherever they could. Unable to fly, and barely able to float, with his 10 extra wet survivors clinging to his plane, Burns turned and taxied towards Tang. On the way, the sea got even rougher, and it is a testament to the toughness of the Kingfisher that the airplane survived at all, being heavily weighed down and pushing through one 5-foot wave after another. The ocean was basically trying to disassemble the aircraft the whole way. Finally, Burns got over to Tang and offloaded everyone, including himself, onto the submarine, but not before one of the crew of the sub snapped a picture of them. Burns got the Navy Cross for his efforts, and all of the airmen got the chance to act as submariners, as Tang didn't bring them home right away and continued on its patrol before getting them home. The only sad thing about the story was that Burns' noble steed, his faithful Kingfisher, had been so badly damaged during the rescue that it had to be scuttled by the sub crew with their deck gun. They waited until he had gone below so that he didn't have to see it. Survivors. The Kingfisher is an example of one of those aircraft that survived even after another airplane was designed, built, and commissioned to replace it. The Curtiss SO-3C Seamew was that replacement, but couldn't replace the venerable Kingfisher. The Ranger air-cooled inverted V-shape inline engine was actually one of the main problems with the Seamew, as it was underpowered and never reliable, no matter how much tinkering they did to fix it. Crews called the plane the Sea Cow, which shows what they thought of it. Also, the Seamew had major stability problems. The U.S. offered some of them to the Royal Navy, and they said no thanks. But the Kingfishers just kept on trucking. It finally took the introduction of the Curtiss SC Seahawk in October 1944 to finally begin the process of retiring the Kingfishers. Of the 1,519 Kingfishers built, none are presently airworthy, although you can see the National Air and Space Museum's Kingfisher at the Boeing Aviation Hangar at the Stephen F. Udvar-Hazy Center in Chantilly, Virginia. At the Battleship North Carolina in Wilmington, Virginia, you can also see a Kingfisher. If you're ever there, take a minute to think about Lieutenant Burns, who was launched from that very ship in a plane just like the one on display to save his brother airmen in peril on the high seas. If you enjoy videos such as these, please like and subscribe to never miss a thing. No one has ever clicked super thanks yet, and I would really appreciate it if somebody would so that I could see what actually happens. Until next time.